Today's talk will be on plant diseases and abiotic disorders, presented by Dr. Belinda Messenger-Sikes, UC IPM's Urban Writer-Editor. Belinda earned her doctorate in plant pathology from UC Riverside, where she studied the effects of calcium on avocado root rot. Since then, she has worked in biopesticide research and IPM education. Belinda loves to translate integrated pest management for general audiences.
Okay.
All right, take it away, Belinda.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. As I said before, I know there's a lot of people on here who are much better gardeners than I am, but I'm going to just cover the basics of plant diseases and abiotic disorders. There's a lot of information on our website that you can look at later if you want to know more than I cover here. So there are 4 things you need to know about plant diseases. I'm sorry, Elaine, I will say next slide. First off, you want to know the difference between a sign and a symptom. This is going to help you figure out what kind of problem your plant is having. Next, you want to know that there are 4 major plant pathogens: fungi, bacteria, viruses, and nematodes. And we're going to look at diseases caused by each type of pathogen. Number 3, in order for a plant to become diseased, it needs to be susceptible and must encounter a virulent pathogen, that is, one that can attack that particular plant. It also has to be in a favorable environment for the disease. 4, there's this concept called the disease cycle, and it's describing how the pathogen and the host plant interact. Next slide, please. Okay, what is plant disease? So plant disease is an abnormal condition that changes how the plant looks or grows. You can have either an infectious disease that's caused by a plant pathogen, which are also called biotic diseases, like life biotic. Plants can also get abiotic diseases, which are also called abiotic disorders. So that's how I'm going to term it here, just to kind of differentiate it easily: by infectious diseases, abiotic disorders. Some common plant diseases that you might have seen or heard of include fire blight and powdery mildew. The symptoms of a plant disease are the visible effects of the disease and is the plant's response to the pathogen. Symptoms are useful in diagnosing a disease, but they're not definitive. Many symptoms are common to more than one disease, and symptoms can vary even within the same disease. Some examples of pathogens, like a tomato that's wilting on one side or cankers on a tree trunk. Seeing the actual pathogen is called a sign. So examples of signs include the powdery mildew spores you'll see on a leaf, or the mycelium, or rust pustules on a rose leaf. Seeing physical evidence of the pathogen allows you to be more confident in your disease diagnosis, which is going to be important. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay, next. Okay, what causes plant disease? So plant diseases are caused by microscopic pathogens. Most plant diseases are caused by fungi and oomycetes. Now, oomycetes were previously thought to be fungi, but they're now known to be related to brown algae, and they're very common causes of plant diseases, so I've split it out there. Some other plant pathogens are bacteria, and those have to enter the plant through wounds or other openings, which are viruses, which are basically genetic material with a protein coat, and nematodes, which are tiny worms that live in the soil. Nematodes are not quite microscopic, and they're sometimes grouped with invertebrate pests like insects and mites. And if you go onto our pest notes, you'll see that they're under invertebrates rather than plant diseases. I learned nematodes in plant pathology, so that's how I see it. Okay, so here's the disease triangle. This is just, again, showing how the plant and the environment and the pathogen all interact. The bottom one will show just an interaction called the abiotic disease that shows the interaction between the host and the environment. The whole triangle incorporates also the pathogen. So the disease triangle is that graphical representation that shows that a plant disease caused by a pathogen is only going to develop if there's a susceptible plant, a pathogen that can infect that plant, and favorable environmental conditions for the disease to occur. Not all plants are going to be susceptible to all pathogens. The severity of the disease is going to depend on the virulence and the abundance of the pathogen. how susceptible the plant is, and also how conducive the environment is. So for example, powdery mildew on roses, it develops when there's lots of spores of the pathogen, when the rose variety is susceptible to powdery mildew, and when the rose is being grown in a shady area when the temperatures are moderate, between 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, next slide, please. So for an infectious disease to occur, a series of events called the disease cycle must occur. So first you have inoculation. This is when the pathogen contacts the host. If the environmental conditions aren't right, the pathogen may die at this stage and not penetrate the host, so you get no disease. So next step is penetration. The pathogen is going to enter the plant. It can get in through wounds or natural openings in the plant, like stomata or lenticels. Sometimes it can just penetrate directly into the plant, depending on the pathogen. And then some pathogens, like powdery mildew and sooty mold, are going to stay on the surface of the plant and still cause disease. Infection happens as the pathogen moves and grows through the plant host. This is a stage where you'll start to see disease symptoms as the plant reacts to the presence of the pathogen. Next is dissemination. This is when the pathogen moves from plant to plant. Pathogens can move in a number of ways, such as with the splashing of water or rain, irrigation, with wind. They can move with insect vectors or with people. At this stage, you might see signs of the pathogen, like a mushroom. Overwintering is the pathogen's survival mechanism. This is when the host or plant is not conducive to the pathogen's growth anymore. So it's usually during winter when it's cold. Many pathogens have resting structures at this time. This is a good time to control plant diseases because they're not moving, they're just staying in place. So this is a sample, a general sample of this process. Every plant pathogen host combination has variations on this cycle. When we go to the next slide, we'll discuss a specific one. This is the disease cycle of Anthracnose on walnuts. This fungal disease causes leaf blotches and spots. It can also damage the nuts. While it generally doesn't kill the tree, it can cause leaf drop. This can reduce yield also. The disease is initiated in the spring when the wind blows spores from dropped leaves and fruit onto new leaves and twigs. During the summer, the spores germinate and infect the plant. In the fall, when the leaves and nuts fall, they have spores within them that become resting spores. This fungus will overwinter in fallen leaves and nuts. So clearing out those dead leaves and the dropped walnuts in the winter is going to reduce the disease in the spring because it's reducing the amount of inoculum. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so speaking of inoculum, this is the part of the pathogen that can infect the plant. The source of the inoculum is going to vary for each disease. Often it's fungi, we call them spores. But cleaning up the garden at the end of the growing season is important because the inoculum can remain in dead and organic matter. Inoculum from plant pathogens can also be in the soil, on weeds or other plants, in seeds, or on tools, usually on the soil that might be sticking on your tools. It can be carried by wind, water, by insect vectors, even by people or other animals. Let's see, what else do I want to say about that one? Yeah, so those are how they can spread the inoculum. Okay, next slide, please. Managing plant diseases. So how do you manage plant diseases? The most effective way is with an integrated approach. And that integrated approach, IPM, Integrated Pest Management, is going to start with prevention. It's the easiest thing to do is to prevent the disease from coming in the first place. I've had lots of people ask me, I have this diseased plant, what do I do? Well, it's diseased. You're probably just gonna have to get rid of it and get a new one, is usually how we say, especially with houseplants, just to get rid of it, get a new one. The first thing you do after you've got a disease, unfortunately, is you want to identify that disease and keep track of how it's progressing. And then you use a combination of cultural, mechanical, and chemical controls to manage that disease. And I'll go into these a little bit more detail. So in the next slide. So prevention, I talked about how important that is. So one way to prevent plant diseases is by planting resistant plant varieties. Some varieties are just naturally resistant or tolerant to diseases. Others are bred to be that way. You can find root knot root knot nematode resistant vegetables. You can find Verticillium fusarium nematode tobacco mosaic resistant tomatoes. You can find roses that are resistant to rust, powdery mildew, and black spot. And you can find apples that are resistant to apple scab, powdery mildew, and fire blight. Check the plant tag when you shop for plants to see if it says it's disease resistant, like on the strawberry tag. Okay, next. So you have a plant disease, then you need to know what it is. So you need to get some information. Both diagnosing it and then monitoring its progress are both crucial. First, know what plant you're working with. Remember, not every plant is susceptible to every pathogen. Without a lab to help you diagnose the disease, you need to visually inspect different parts of the plant, and if possible, inspect multiples of that type of plant growing in your garden. You can make a guess based on disease symptoms, but if you absolutely need confirmation, a laboratory diagnosis is necessary for definite identification. Remember, these are microbial, so they're very small. They'd have to be grown out in culture to see what is actually in the plant. So know your host plant, including the cultivar. Sometimes you need to know what's normal for that specific cultivar. You may look at it and go, oh, it's kind of wilty looking. Well, maybe that particular cultivar is kind of wilty looking normally. So know what the plant is supposed to look like. And if you suspect something's not right, you check for the easy stuff. Are there any signs of the pathogen? Do you see mushrooms, mycelium, sclerotia? If you have signs of the pathogen, that's going to help you diagnose it as a disease and find out what disease it is. You might not see signs though, so you'll have to rely on the symptoms, the plant, how it's reacting to that pathogen. The symptoms are going to vary depending on the plant, the environment, and the pathogen. What's the weather been like? Sometimes you'll see things are starting to wilt if it's too hot, but if it's not hot, maybe the wilting isn't happening, and so you're going to miss that particular symptom. So symptoms can include under or overdevelopment of the flowers, the leaves, the tree, the shoots, the overall plant in general. You might see necrotic tissue, which is brown, dying leaves or other parts of the plant. The plant just might look funny. It might have, the leaves might be curled or too small or just weird looking. Finally, make sure you look at the roots. What do the roots look like? Do they look healthy? Or are they brown? There's not very many of them. Always check the roots. Are the symptoms variable? Are they on just some part of the plant, or are they on the whole thing? So monitoring is that second piece. Plant diseases can spread fast. Time is the fourth variable in disease epidemics. So you want to keep track of that. Check your plants regularly. Respond quickly if you see something that you think is a disease. Okay, next. The diagnosis can be difficult. You can't always rely on symptoms, like I said. So here's two different foliar cucumber diseases. They look really similar though. The top one is downy mildew. It's caused by an oomycete. The bottom is angular leaf spot. That's caused by a bacterium. These photographs are showing similar symptoms, but in the garden, if you're keeping watch on your plants, you'll see that the symptoms are not always the same. They change over time. Angular leaf spot is going to begin with a water-soaked spot that later turns gray or tan. The spots may initially develop a yellow halo, as you can see here on that bottom photo. Eventually, the spots are going to turn into ragged holes. Now, on the other hand, downy mildew, which also has this like angular yellow spots, it will start out that way, but those are going to coalesce and then the whole leaf will turn brown. So it's going to look really different on the end stages of the disease. Again, so keep track of what's going on with the plant. Next slide. So cultural practices, what do you do about plant diseases? You've got a disease, you know what it is. So sanitation is something that you can do in the garden quite easily, and it's a cultural practice that we really encourage. It can both prevent the plant diseases from getting hold, and it can also reduce their spread. So here's how you want to do it. You want to work in the uninfested areas of the garden or landscape first, so that you don't spread the disease to the uninfected plants. You want to clean your shoes and your tools and disinfect your pruning tools to help control the spread of disease. You don't want to move it from parts of the infected part of the garden to the uninfected. Many of the pathogens I've talked about can overwinter in leaf litter, in dead twigs, in dried fruit, and other organic matter. So clean the garden at the end of the growing season to reduce that inoculum. In this photo here, you see mummies on the left-hand side of the screen. Those are dried up nectarines that have been infected by brown rot the previous year. They're hanging there next to the ripe nectarines. Those mummies are a source of inoculum, and they should be removed so that the new fruit does not get infected with the brown rot. Okay, next, so another cultural practice is irrigation management. Proper irrigation is going to help prevent plant disease. So what do I mean by proper irrigation? You need to know your plants. How much water does that plant need? What kind of soil do you have? Does it drain quickly? Does it drain slowly? And then the local climate you're growing in, that will help you water properly. Plant roots need both oxygen and water. So manage your irrigation so that the soil drains well. Most pathogenic fungi and bacteria, especially those that grow in the soil, need moisture to infect the plants. So you don't want to let your soil get waterlogged. In the most part, you're going to want to avoid overhead watering. Overhead watering can splash pathogens from the soil onto the leaves or from leaf to leaf. It also creates a conducive environment for pathogens to infect the plant hosts. When you water trees, water the drip line out where the roots are, not the trunk. When you water the trunk, you're going to make it susceptible to cankers and other kind of rots. The photo I'm showing here has drip irrigation that's targeting individual plants. In addition to preventing foliar diseases, drip irrigation gets the right amount of water to the plant, saves water, and reduces weeds. Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Pruning is a mechanical disease management practice. It's a good way to reduce the spread of a pathogen within a plant, but if it's done poorly or at the wrong time of the year, it can damage the plant and make it more susceptible to disease or spread the disease further. When you prune, be sure to cut into the healthy plant tissue below the infection. Also, dispose of those infected branches, leaves, and fruit. Don't go overboard with pruning because that could make the disease worse. Just like I said, prune just below the infection into the healthy tissue. Often you'll see that pruning will induce the plant to put out new growth. That can lead to diseases like powdery mildew and other pathogens that need succulent new growth to infect. So be sure that you're pruning at the right time. So for instance, the right time to prune diseased almond trees is when they're dormant. But on the other hand, you'll want to prune apricots in August to allow time for the pruning wounds to close up before the winter rains. Next. Chemical control. It's not going to be very effective in most home garden or landscape situations. For one thing, pesticides can kill natural enemies, leading to an outbreak of pests. While those pests aren't plant diseases, you don't want to have to deal with insect or mites in addition to the plant disease. So in order for chemical disease control to work, you need to accurately identify the disease and apply the right pesticide at the right time. A broad spectrum pesticide isn't necessarily going to take care of the disease if you're not choosing the right one and you're not putting it down at the right time. You can control foliage infecting fungi like powdery mildew, rust, and peach leaf curl with fungicides as long as you time your application right. If you see disease symptoms, in most cases, it's too late for a pesticide to be effective because most of these fungicides are protective. They don't cure the disease. Powdery mildew is going to be the one exception to this. A fungicide can actually cure the disease because the fungus is growing on the outside of the plant. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so let's talk about some specifics, some common plant diseases in home gardens. Most of these, as I said, are fungal diseases, but we're going to talk about some other ones too. Next, okay, fire blight. Fire blight is a common bacterial disease. It's caused by Erwinia amylovera. It affects pears. Often you'll see those on the bread for pears, the ornamental pears. It also can affect quince, apple, crabapple, firethorn, hawthorn, loquat, mountain ash, and other related plants. It causes wilting and this distinctive blasted look where the shoots and flowers shrivel up and turn brown and then black. If you see these symptoms in a palm tree or in related plants, you could have fire blight. The bacteria that causes disease grow quickly in warm, wet weather, and they often will enter through the flowers. That's when you might see bacterial ooze, which is a sign of the disease. It's the actual bacteria. It's easily spread at this point by rain, by water splashing, and even pollinators as they visit flowers. You want to manage this disease by paying attention to water. Don't water when the tree is in bloom, and don't splash that water. Remove diseased branches in the summer when it's dry. Fire blight is best managed by planting plants that are less prone to infection. We also have a whole pest notes on fire blight, as we do on many of these plant diseases. Next, another common plant disease is peach leaf curl, which is also caused by a fungus, this one, sorry. This is Tophrina deformans. The only host plants for this disease are peach and nectarine. So if you see this kind of symptom on another kind of plant, you can rule out peach leaf curl. And conversely, if you see this on your peach tree, you're going to be pretty certain that that's what you're dealing with. The symptoms, as you can see here, include puckered, twisted leaves that turn red and look blistered. The fungus is going to spread from leaf to leaf in water drops, such as when it rains or during irrigation. To prevent peach leaf curl, use resistant peach and nectarine varieties where possible. When you have a non-resistant variety, you're going to have to treat the tree with a fungicide every year after the leaves have fallen. Because once you see the symptoms, like you see here on the picture, it's too late to manage the disease that year. Wait until the leaves fall off and then treat. And don't forget to get rid of those old leaves too, so that you don't leave inoculum in your garden for the following year. Next. So anthracnose is a general term. It can be caused by a lot of different fungi. Lots of different plants are susceptible to anthracnose, such as Chinese elm, sycamore, oak, ash, and even some fruits and vegetables. Most anthracnose diseases are minor on most of the host plants, except for Chinese elm. In Chinese elm, the fungus will cause cankers that can girdle and kill those trees. The symptom of anthracnose can vary depending on the plant and the weather, but usually include some sort of leaf spot or cankers. As with many fungal diseases, this one is spread by rain splash, but it can also be windblown. Manage anthracnose by choosing plants that are resistant to anthracnose-causing fungi. When you plant, space them up far enough apart to maximize air circulation and increase sunlight. This photo shows leaf spots and a dead leaf on a sycamore tree. Those were caused by anthracnose infection. Okay, next slide, please. Powdery mildew. Most people are going to be probably quite familiar with this one. It's very common, especially on cucurbits. But the fungi causing powdery mildew can also infect grapes, crepe myrtle, roses, sycamore, and other plants. The distinctive fuzzy white patches on the leaves, shoots, and fruits are actually the mycelium, the branching cells of the pathogen, and its spores. This sign of the pathogen enables you to correctly identify the disease. This fungus overwinters in leaf litter and is spread by wind. So again, we're hearing a lot of this overwintering in leaf litter. Sort of, if you take nothing away from this, please take away that you need to clean up all those dead leaves to prevent plant diseases. The environment, as always with plant diseases, is crucial with powdery mildew. But strangely, unlike other fungal diseases, powdery mildew doesn't need free water on the leaf to germinate. In fact, free water on the leaf will kill the germinating spores and mycelium of some powdery mildew fungi. Overhead sprinkling can reduce powdery mildew by washing the spores off the plants. However, it can also make other plant diseases worse. So be aware of that if you try to get rid of your powdery mildew with water. Prevent powdery mildew by planting in sunny locations with space between the plants for good air circulation. Okay, next slide. So here's some more different symptoms of powdery mildew on different hosts. The one on the left is powdery mildew on pea caused by Aeration. And the one on the right is powdery mildew on tomato caused by a different Ehrsichia, Lycopersicii. These are those distinctive white patches that you might associate with powdery mildew are not present at this time. So these simple symptoms could fool you into thinking you're dealing with another disease. The powdery mildews that affect artichokes, onions, peppers, and tomatoes produce yellow patches in the leaves, but hardly ever will they put out powdery growth. So you kind of have to keep track of that and see, familiarize yourself with powdery mildew symptoms on your specific host. And you can find that information on our website. Next slide, please. With downy mildew. Downy mildew is caused by oomycetes, which are those pathogens that sometimes are called water molds, but are actually a form of brown algae. They're not fungi. Many vegetable plants are susceptible to downy mildew, including cucurbits, cole crops, lettuce, peas, spinach, onions, and garlic. Typical symptoms of downy mildew include those downy masses of spores on the undersides of affected leaves, with yellow, irregular patches on the top, like I showed earlier. These chlorotic lesions will eventually turn brown and coalesce. The spores can be spread by wind. This oomycete overwinters in old roots and needs cool, moist weather for infection and disease development to occur. So this is more of a springtime disease versus maybe in the summertime, you'll see a powdery mildew. The photo here shows the brown irregular spots of downy mildew on a collard leaf. Okay, next, here's some more downy mildew on cucurbit and peas. The cucurbit leaf on the left shows the characteristic angular leaf spots of downy mildew. The symptom on peas is, however, is reminiscent of rust, but the growth is more cottony and sort of all over the bottom of the leaf. So we do have downy mildew in the Sacramento Valley, also upper San Joaquin, Imperial, and in coastal areas. It attacks all cucurbits, but cucumber is the most common infected vegetable. Okay, next slide, please. So you might confuse downy mildew and powdery mildew. I know I have in the past. However, these two diseases will differ in a few important ways. So you'll need to collect some information about your growing situation. Powdery mildew thrives in warm, dry weather, whereas downy mildew is a cool weather disease. So, that's one thing to ask yourself. Okay, what's the weather been like? Downy mildew will produce spores mostly on the underside of the leaves and only after rain or very heavy fog. The spores will disappear soon after the leaves dry out. Powdery mildew does not require water on the leaf surface for spore formation, and the powdery growth appears on both sides of the leaf. Again, and it likes that hot, dry weather. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so rusts are caused by various fungi, which are very specific to their host. They're considered one of the more developed of the fungi in terms of evolution. They are very specific. One individual rust species will go to one individual kind of plant. Host plants for rust include roses, as you can see in the photo here, caneberries, rhododendron, stone fruit, pine trees, and even some grasses. The pustules are formed of masses of rust spores, which are the infectious part of the pathogen. So that means we're looking at a sign of the disease as opposed to a symptom. Spores of rust can be spread through rain and water splashing and through wind. The photograph shows those yellow-orange pustules on the top and the bottom of rose leaves. Next slide, please. Okay, damping off. Damping off is caused most often by Pythium, which is an oomycete. Seedlings that will often fail to come up or die soon after they've emerged from the soil are often caused by this disease called damping off. The disease occurs when the seeds are planted in soil that's too cold and wet for them to quickly germinate. There are some other species of fungi and oomycetes that cause damping off, such as Fusarium rhizoctonia and Phytophthora. But as I said, Pythium is the most often the cause here. The picture of this bean seedling shows a characteristic brown rot at the base of the plant. It causes this rapid decay and the plant will flop over if it even emerges to begin with. Damping off is something that can happen to all plants at the seedling stage. Manage it with good sanitation, quality planting material, and well-drained soil. Plant when the temperatures are warm enough for the seedlings to grow quickly. Okay, next, here's my favorite, crown rot. Crown and root rots caused by Phytophthora. These can be very hard to identify because many of the symptoms look just like water deficiency. This can include wilting and stunted growth. The roots turn brown. They may be discolored leaves, darkened bark, and cankers. You won't see any sign of the pathogen because they are microscopic. Definitive identification has to be performed by a plant pathologist using laboratory techniques. This photo shows an avocado tree infected with Phytophthora cinnamomi. In the photo, you can see wilted leaves and a sparse canopy, particularly at the top of the tree. The lower leaves are also wilted. The inset image is a sporangium. Inside that sporangium are the swimming spores called zoospores. The zoospores will release and swim through the water in the soil to the host plant and infect the roots and crowns. Zoospores can also be splashed up onto the tree's trunk, infecting there and causing cankers. Phytophthora can cause root and crown rot on many plants, including avocado, rhododendron, almost all fruit and nut trees, and vegetables. Sudden oak death is also caused by Phytophthora. The name Phytophthora is from the Greek and it means plant destroyer. The host list for this disease is very long. Lots and lots of plants are susceptible. Phytophthora diseases are best prevented through sanitation, good water management, and resistant varieties when available. In the case of avocado root rot, top dressings of gypsum can help manage the disease. And I can tell you that from personal experience, as that was the subject of my dissertation. So Armillaria root rot is another fungal disease. As you can see by the mushrooms growing around the tree in this photo. This is a sign since you're seeing the pathogen itself. The mushrooms are sometimes called honey mushrooms, but that's because of color, not the taste. Don't try to eat these mushrooms. They're not going to taste like honey. Even when they're thoroughly cooked, they can be toxic. Armillaria can infect many woody plants, including elm, oaks, and pines. The disease severity will depend on the health of the host plant. Old trees often decline and die quickly if they're infected with Armillaria. Younger trees may show a sparse canopy, but you can sometimes get them to bounce back from the disease. The fungus will spread through the soil from tree to tree through rhizomorphs, which are these long root kind of structures that the fungus produces. Manage Armillaria by reducing tree stress and ensuring that the trees are in good condition. Don't over-irrigate, especially with native oaks. Okay, next slide. Lawn diseases. This is a huge, huge topic. They're usually caused by fungi or oomycetes. The grass turns yellow or brown in patches. There are many similar appearing lawn diseases. So the first thing you want to know is what kind of grass is showing those disease symptoms, and that will help you narrow it down. The environmental conditions are also very important. Some diseases only occur when it's cool, others only when it's hot. Waterlogged soil can often lead to disease development as well. The photograph shows fusarium blight in annual bluegrass, a variety susceptible to this disease. The symptom includes irregular spots of dead turf, ranging from a few inches to a foot across. The dead turf appears bleached. Sometimes plants in the center of the spots survive, giving the spot a frog eye appearance, which is a distinctive symptom for this disease. We have a lot of information specific to disease, to turf grasses and their associated diseases, both in our pest notes and also on the UC Guide to Healthy Lawns. Next slide. So I mentioned this bacterial disease earlier. The disease has different names depending on the host, but bacterial blast, blight, and canker are all caused by the same bacterium, Pseudomonas syringae. A lot of plants are susceptible to this disease, including lilacs, vegetables, and fruit and nut trees. Tip dieback symptoms are caused by this pathogen, And they're similar to fire blight, but they rarely extend more than a couple of inches down the shoot tip. So that's one way to distinguish them. In this photo, the bacteria is oozing out of a developing canker. A canker is a depressed, darkened area in the bark. This bacterial ooze, a sign of the disease, can be splashed in water to other parts of the plant or onto nearby plants, spreading the disease. Lilac leaves and shoots sometimes discolor, they turn brown or red, shrivel and die when they're infected with this bacterium. Vigorous plants have less trouble with bacterial canker. Fertilize and irrigate properly for good plant growth. If you're planting new trees, look for those on a disease-resistant rootstock. Some lilac species are more resistant to bacterial blight as well. Next slide. Viruses. Plant viruses, just like human viruses, require a host to reproduce. They're submicroscopic, so you're only going to see their symptoms, never a sign. They can cause an array of patterns on leaves and flowers, as well as necrosis and stunting. In some cases, there won't be any symptoms at all. Some plant viruses are spread by humans through grafting and propagation. Others are spread by insects or soil-borne fungi. The photograph shows virus-induced patterns on a cucumber leaf. The leaf turns yellow in patches, then the edges of the leaves turn brown and necrotic. Manage plant viruses with the use of virus-tested planting stock and resistant varieties. You can't cure a virus disease. Next, nematodes. Nematodes are tiny roundworms. They're sometimes plant parasites. They live in the soil and they attack the roots of susceptible plants. There are also nematodes that attack pest insects or other nematodes. Many plants are susceptible to nematode infection, like ornamentals, vegetables, and fruit and nut trees. The photograph shows the characteristic root galls caused by nematodes burrowing into and feeding on the roots. The nematodes slow plant growth, reduce yield, and can cause wilting and leaf drop. Management of nematodes is difficult. They spread in infested soil, so the most reliable management practices are preventive, including sanitation and choice of resistant plant varieties. Next. I've quickly covered some of the more common plant diseases. Most of the time, it's best to prevent disease in your garden with resistant varieties and by keeping your garden clear of pathogen inoculum. A few techniques that work well for managing plant disease are pruning, water management, in the case of some foliar diseases like peach leaf curl, the use of pesticides. Next slide. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about abiotic disorders of plants. Abiotic disorders are non-infectious diseases. That is, there is no pathogen involved. Most common abiotic disorders are due to issues with the soil. Next slide. They are problems caused by something in the environment. You can't fix this type of problem with a pesticide, so it's important to know if the problem has an abiotic cause or if it's an actual infectious disease. Most of the common abiotic disorders are due to issues with the soil. Water, too much or not enough. Nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, iron, manganese, etc., too much or not enough. High pH, which can lead to nutrient availability problems. Too much sunlight can burn leaves. And there are other abiotic disorders such as air pollutants like ozone, temperature extremes, and herbicides. We'll go over a few of those. So next slide, irrigation. So too much and too little. Moisture imbalances can both mimic and trigger plant diseases. Both can cause crown dieback of trees because there aren't enough roots to feed the leaves. A mild and prolonged deficit of water can cause reduced growth, tip dieback, wilting, fading, and premature leaf drop. If there's a chronic water deficit, you can see salt buildup leading to leaf margin necrosis and branch dieback. An excess of water can lead to aeration deficiency. Roots that are too wet don't get enough oxygen, killing them, which then increases disease susceptibility. The branch dieback in this photo was caused by the tree not receiving enough water over a long time, so a deficit of water. Next slide. Blossom end rot is not an infectious disease. It's actually a symptom of a water deficit. During hot weather, tomatoes, peppers, and squash are susceptible to blossom end rot. you'll see a small spot which will enlarge into a sunken leathery lesion on the bottom of the fruit, as seen in this photo. This disorder occurs when not enough water can move through the plant, leading to a calcium deficiency in the fruit. Anything that causes the roots to be unable to take up enough water for the rapidly growing plant can lead to blossom and rot. Next slide. Aeration deficiency. So on the other hand, over-irrigation can lead to aeration deficiency. This commonly occurs in irrigated landscapes. As you can see here, you see the puddle around the plant. Aeration deficiency is where there isn't enough air in the soil for the roots. Roots need to have oxygen, so air movement through the soil is essential. The key sign of aeration deficiency is soil that is waterlogged and bluish gray to black. Often the soil will smell like rotten eggs. At first, the symptoms may look like the plant isn't getting enough water. The plant wilts and drops leaves. If the aeration deficit continues, the roots will die and the plant growth will be stunted. And at that point, plant diseases can move in. The photo shows a tree suffering from aeration deficiency caused by waterlogged soil. The canopy is sparse from leaves dropping prematurely, and the remaining leaves are starting to turn yellow. Next slide. So nutrient problems. Adding too much fertilizer or chronic under-irrigation can cause salts to build up in the soil. You might see tip dieback, burn, and other symptoms. Of the macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, nitrogen is the most common deficiency. Fruit and nut trees, palms, plants, and containers can all become nitrogen deficient. The micronutrients iron, manganese, and zinc are the most common micronutrient deficiencies. Most garden soils, however, have enough of these micronutrients, but sometimes the conditions in the soil can inhibit the plant roots from taking them up. Before adding fertilizer, make sure that the soil is draining properly and the plant roots are healthy. The photo here shows iron deficiency, which is where you see yellowing leaves with dark green veins. Next slide, please. Symptoms of pH issues are going to look like nutrient deficiency symptoms. That's because the soil pH affects availability of nutrients in the soil. If the soil pH is too high, plants are unable to take up enough nutrients and they will show deficiency symptoms. If you need to, you're going to want to amend the soil to lower the pH if you've got a high pH, which is a very basic soil. Next slide, please. Sunburn and sun scald. So this might look like a plant disease is all you have if all you have is a leaf. You want to find out what the rest of the plant and the surrounding plants look like. Sunburn is caused by too much sunlight on a plant, so you'll see it most severely on the west and south sides of the plant, on the barks or on the leaf. These reddish brown shiny spots on the leaves are a typical symptom. You could also see sunburn on fruit or bark. The bark will become discolored and may crack or develop cankers. You might notice that almond growers in California will paint the trunks of their trees white. This is to prevent sunburn. You can do the same with your own garden trees if you need to, if they're exposed to intense sunlight. Paint the tree trunks of young trees with an interior white latex paint that's been diluted by half with water. Next slide. So is this a disease or a disorder? You probably already know because I've talked about this before. This shows leaves that are distorted and curled with swollen red galls. There are other possibilities for these symptoms, including insect damage, herbicide toxicity, nutrient deficiency, or the peach leaf curl fungus Tetraphrina deformans. Find out what kind of plant it is, and that will help you determine the cause of the symptoms. In this case, it's a peach leaf. So that's going to point us to the peach leaf curl disease. Next, that was an easy one, wasn't it? So how do we distinguish plant diseases from abiotic disorders? Know what your host plant is, including the cultivar. That's going to narrow down the possibilities and allow you to use our online tools more effectively. Are those symptoms typical of the cultivar, not an actual problem? Is the plant reaching the end of its lifespan? Are those symptoms typical for the age of the plant and not indicative of a problem? Is the plant growing in its preferred location? Does it need more or less sun? Is it overcrowded? Other environmental conditions to consider. Is it getting too much or too little water? Is it getting enough fertilizer? Are you seeing nutrient deficiencies? Is it getting too much sun? Other nearby plants affected? If they are they the same species or are they different? Usually the disease is only going to affect a single species, and abiotic disorders will affect more than one. Are you seeing the problem in one location, or is it spread out across the landscape? Symptoms that are spread out tend to be abiotic, especially if you see them quickly overnight. Symptoms that progress slowly over time are more likely to be a disease. So on the next slide, I'm going to show a few little tips that will break down those disease versus a disorder. So with a disease, if you see the sign of a living pest like mushrooms or spores, you know you're dealing with a disease, whereas you're not going to ever see signs of a pest with a disorder. When symptoms develop slowly and get worse over time, this is going to point to a disease. Symptoms that develop suddenly over the whole plant are going to be more likely to be a disorder. If the symptoms uneven on the plant, that could, like maybe just the bark or just the top leaves, that's going to point more to the disease. A disorder is going to be consistent on that plant and on similar plants. Remember, it's an environmental condition, so it's going to affect everything around it. Symptoms that are only appearing on one type of a plant or closely related plants could be a disease, but if it's on unrelated plants, it's most likely to be a disorder, because remember, plant diseases tend to be quite specific. Next slide. Okay, well, I hope this introduction to plant diseases was helpful. We have a lot of resources on the UC-IPM website about specific plant diseases.
Thank you so much, Belinda, and we thank you all so much for joining us today. Take care.